Now, we're going to cover in this first lesson here the two biggest things that tend to frustrate beginners. And even if you don't consider yourself a beginner and you've had me before or you've had another watercolor class before, these are two areas that take some time to master. And so it's good practice, regardless of how much you've been doing watercolor. I still need to practice these things sometimes. All right, so first one is pigment to water ratio, which can be terribly confusing. Let me make sure this is still recording. I don't want to do this for nothing. Okay, we're good. One time I did that, taught a whole lesson, and it wasn't recording. All right, pigment to water ratio takes a lot of practice, and you cannot just rush this process. All right, so we're going to practice. Quick note again about brushes. Do not fidget with them. Okay, these brushes are pretty old, but it's very firm to the touch because I have taken good care of this brush and I have not frayed it and I have not messed with it so much and I have not used soap on it. And so the gum or the resin, whatever that they put on different types of brushes to hold its shape is still there. So that is great. So it's holding this perfect, nice shape. To loosen that, I don't use my fingers. I'm going to dip it in the water and gently tap until that gelatin, glue, resin, it's different depending on the type of brush, loosens a little bit. All right, and now it's nice and soft, ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to take a few drops of water. I'm going to make a little puddle. I had said quarter size, but it seemed like people were going a little too large, so let's say nickel size puddle of water right there. All right, now I don't want my brush to be sopping wet. I just want it to be damp. Okay, if it's sopping wet, it's going to make a big slushy mess in my palette, which I don't want. I just need enough water that I can go in, let's pick this color, and start to loosen the pigment off of here. I'm going to roll the brush and then go drop that in my puddle there. I'm not going back to get more water. There's plenty of moisture on the brush here. So I'm going to keep doing that, and it takes a little bit of time. All right, what I noticed the first two classes is that people were painting too thin and too light. And now that is part of the beauty of watercolors. It's very transparent. We want that translucent quality to a degree. Right? We still want to be able to have enough pigment to get it to do the dark, vibrant things that we might want. All right, now, in the palette, the way it looks in a puddle is not going to be necessarily what it looks like on the paper. So you always want to have some scrap paper. Whoops, that was one thing I forgot to get here. You always want scrap paper nearby as well. There we go. All right, so I'm going to test my color. And you can see, even though it looks really dark here, it's still pretty watery and thin. All right, and that just means I need more pigment to my water ratio. So I'm going to go back here and keep doing this. Again, I have not gone back to get fresh water. We don't need it. I'm trying to just lift more of the thick pigment. And it'll get a little gummy, and then it'll start to dissolve more, and that'll be good. And I'll be able to pick up even more at a time. If you're not used to working with the dry paints in previous years I gave you guys tube paints, which speeds up this process. There we go. That's a little bit darker color. Okay. It takes some getting used to have to wet this, but not wet it so much that you have a big sloppy mess. All right, so this is more like the coverage that I want. All right, so I can do a stroke, different patterns, and I'm not losing the intensity and the vibrancy of the paint. Okay, let me see. There, whoop. You can see how this one thinned out more than I wanted it to, unless I was going for that, but I was trying to go for more intense color. All right, so that's one thing I want you to practice is you need to be able to control the amount of water to paint so that you can get the desired effect you want. Now, let's say I'm happy with this color. I want to make a really, really thin, light version of it. Okay, what I'm not going to do is go dump a whole bunch of extra water into that puddle. Instead, I'm going to create a new puddle by first making sure the brush is not wet. Okay, so I'm tapping it over here to get most of the moisture out of it. I'm going to roll it, soak it real good in that color I already made, and pull some of that over here. And then I'm going to go in and just dip my brush in quickly to get a little bit more water, and then mix that in. And now that should give me a shade or two lighter than what I already have. So let's see if it worked. There we go. Good. And then I can try that again. Say, that's still darker than I want. I want to go lighter. I will dip it back in the water again, not too much. And every time I do that, it's going to lighten this puddle, but not so dramatically that I can't work with it. Okay, and there we're getting lighter and lighter. There we go. Now, with watercolor, you're going to constantly be doing this because you're going to run out of this and you're going to have to recreate the color. So it can be a little time consuming and frustrating at the beginning, and that is normal. And the more you practice, and the more you're going to get really comfortable with it, and it will be second nature eventually. All right, let me show you what happens if you do the other thing where you add way too much water. Okay, so we tend to do this. We just keep going back, rinsing, adding more water, rinsing, adding more water. And this gets super thin and watery. And beginners especially, we want to have like a giant puddle because we're afraid we're going to run out. And then what happens is it ends up being so thin and watery that we get this problem. All right, where there's almost no pigment down here, and we got this big watery soupy mess up there. And it seems like no matter what I do to it, I keep going back and adding more, the problem just keeps getting worse. Okay, it might start to look darker at first, but then watch what's going to happen. Because there's so much water, when it dries, it's going to do this kind of stuff. See how the water color is rolling around? Now, if I wanted that for a certain effect, great. If I wanted more control, that's not great. If I want it to dry quickly, that's not great. If I want to paint something next to it in a different color, and it's still really wet, then we're going to have bleeding and all kinds of stuff happen that we might not necessarily want. Okay, so when there's so much water in there that it's going to take forever to dry, when it does dry, it's going to pull in certain areas and make the paper buckle and create all of these bumps, and then you're going to get a very warped looking finished piece. And it's just going to scream beginner. Okay, and we are beginners, but I want to take you from being beginner to more intermediate very quickly. Okay, so we're going to try to learn to avoid these mistakes. Now, having said that, I called them mistakes. There are times when you may want to manipulate this and make it do that on purpose. Okay, but first, I do want to teach control, and that's my next part of this lesson. So first part was pigment to water ratio. You got to play with it, you got to practice until you get comfortable with it. Start with more pigment, less water. Be very, very cautious about going and adding more drops of water. Keep the brush dry, not dry. Well, we call it dry, but it's still moist. But I mean, no dripping water when you go back in to add more pigment to your puddle. All right, so control. Let's mix up another color. So I'm going to rinse this completely. You have 2 water cups, because one is for rinsing, and when it gets too dirty, you want to make sure you have nice, fresh, clean water to go to, so that you don't take this pale purple color I have and end up tainting your yellow or a lighter color when you want a nice, pure color. When this gets too dirty, just go rinse them out. You do not need my permission. You can just quietly get up, go rinse it, and come right back. We don't need to disrupt class for something like that. All right, okay, so let's do green. Okay, so first I'm putting like a drop of water on here. Is that still in the camera? Yeah, we go, okay. Rolling this around. So I'm trying to loosen up the pigment without making a big mess. All right, so I've got some thick paint on there. That's good, I'm gonna drop that over here, and I forgot to add my water. just need a few drops of water. That's enough. I'm going to keep going back, adding more paint. Time will tell if in our very short classes that we have for the middle school, if I'm going to like these palettes or not, or if we're going to want to go back to the tube paints. We'll see. I thought these were really convenient, and I do love them, but in some ways they're a little more time consuming than just squirting out the liquid paint ready to go. Okay, so I got a nice thick color there. Again, I gotta test it and see if I'm happy with it. Ooh, I do like that. Okay, nice. All right, so for practicing control, what I want you to do is draw some basic shapes and some squiggles. Okay. And we're going to practice filling these in, and yes, we're coloring like inside the lines, but with paint. So I'm going to roll my brush in that paint, make sure it's very loaded. All right, and I'm going to try the circle one first. You're going to start on the outside edge, okay? A lot of times we want to start in the middle and go out. I don't want you to do that. I want you to, you'll have much more control and accuracy if you go up to the edge first and wrap around. And then naturally, and I like to turn my paper too, so you can just turn it around. If that helps, you get better angles and more control. You don't have to. Okay, and then you pull that pigment into the center. Right, and we're trying to go for a flat, even wash, like the very first lesson. Okay, and that just takes some time to practice, right? And you can kind of roll it around a little bit. Make sure it's drying nice and even. That's pretty good. All right, let's try another shape. And notice I had enough paint on there, I didn't have to go back and get more. We're gonna start in the corner again, go down. Use that tip of the brush. Then you're going to go back and fill in the rest. There we go. You don't need a super tiny brush to get in these tiny little details. You just need a brush with a nice point. Right, and you're going to stay right on the tiptoe. Just the itty edge, tip of that point on the brush. All right, I much prefer, and you'll find most artists do this as well, to use a larger brush for small areas rather than these itty bitty little tiny things, which I don't use often at all because they do not hold much paint. So you'll see what happens if I roll this. Okay, I'll just show you what happens. So I got this loaded. It's holding as much paint. In fact, it's about to drip off. It's holding a lot of paint. I'm probably going to still have a struggle getting this to fill in a whole space because it's so tiny. I can't cover nearly as much ground. You see how it's running out of energy? It's running out of paint already. And so I get a much more uneven look. Hopefully that's showing up well on the camera. I ran out of pigment, and so like it's getting thinner and thinner all the way off to a dry brush technique where you barely is just picking up little bits here and there and not painting nice and smooth. And that's because this brush can only hold so much water. Whereas this can hold a whole lot more, and as long as I have good control over how much I press down and up on the brush, I can get anything from a super, super skinny, thin line. I'll show you this. See that itty bitty thin line I can get from a pretty big brush? And then all I have to do is just add a little more pressure, and I can get a thicker line. thicker yet. Now I am running out a little bit there. So I got get some more. And then if I want to go really, really thick and wide, you can drag the brush at an angle on the side. All right, so some watercolor artists rely pretty much on just a nice, good size round brush, usually no smaller than a size 6 to 8. You'll see that very common with a lot of artists. You will also see, especially on YouTube, a lot of YouTube artists using these itty bitty things. I don't know why. They choose to do that. Most professional artists go a little bit larger with their brushes. So one nice good round brush with a good point is all you really need. And then there are times when a flat brush comes in very handy, especially when we're trying to cover ground quickly. And so that's why I gave you one of those as well. All right, so that's what I want you guys to work on. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. You don't have to create any masterpieces. You're just working on the control, trying to fill in these little... That's a gross color. I distracted myself. You mix red and green together and you get browns. You'll learn about that more later. Look at that awful gross color I just got. That's terrible. All right, we're totally distracted myself. Oh, I'm just saying, continue. Keep practicing filling in these little spots and just figure out what works and what doesn't. That did not work because it was way too thin. Because remember back here, I added too much water. I forgot that I added too much water to that. And so now look what's happening. There's so much water on there. You see that puddle it's creating if I lift it up? So it's not going to dry flat and even. All right, so that was terrible control. All right, so there was a good example of what not to do. All right, have fun with that. Oh, you can see over here how this is bleeding all crazy. Again, there are times when we want to create that, but that was not the time. Today we were trying to work on controlling the water. After you learn how to control it and get comfortable with how it acts and what it can do and what your tools can do, then you can let the water just do its own thing. But you can't really get to that step and really embrace the beauty of watercolor until you know sort of how it behaves and acts. All right, so have fun practicing that, and I will see you next week.